Okay, Pierce College students, welcome to week 3 macroeconomics, where we really get into the heart and soul of the idea of macro this week, because weeks 1 and 2 introduce students basically to economic principles and concepts, foundational ideas that are relevant to both micro and macro, but we get into the heart and soul of macro this week. So let's start off by discussing briefly some macroeconomic news that we will be inevitably investigating today when we talk about GDP, economic growth, business cycle, unemployment, and inflation. So, who is this guy right there? All right, right here, this guy. All right, this guy. His name is Jerome Powell. All right, and what does he do? All right, he is the chairman of the Federal Reserve, our nation's central bank. So, what's going to be of interest to us by the end of the term is what's called monetary policy. So our nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve, manages the nation's money supply in an effort to sustain what's called full employment, domestic output, and price stability, which is a fancy way of saying the central bank controls the money supply to try to the best of their ability to have the economy growing so that unemployment doesn't grow too high, but not growing too fast so that we have inflation, right? What is the principal tool of the Federal Reserve is interest rates, and we'll talk about interest rate sensitive spending. But a big picture here, the Fed is important when the economy is either doing poorly and it needs some assistance. And in that case, normally we have gross domestic product, the measure of our economic production for the year. We have that faltering and we have unemployment rising. And the Fed is also important when it comes to what we've experienced over the last 18 months is inflation. So it's a good time for us to inject some practical information and economic events into our study of macroeconomics. So that's sort of the big picture intro for this week. Let's go to what you're responsible to do this week. So this is week 3, right? And I actually just sent everyone this information. Week 3 covers chapters 27, 28, 29, 30. And they're not the longest chapters, even though there's 4 of them. So don't be overwhelmed. And you got this, I just sent you this file. Right, on this file for the week 3 file, you have the week 3 lecture notes with practice questions and answers. You have the articles you need to read for the discussion question. And you have this information, which is background information on what you got to do for week 3. All right, so week 3, we're looking at the big picture here, a legitimate introduction to macro thinking. So we're going to talk about how do we measure total economic activity in the country? How do we adjust the measurements for change in the price level over time? Then we'll talk about how we measure economic growth and why economic growth is important. Then we'll talk about the business cycle, and then we'll talk about inflation. All right, so those are our 4 goals for this week. What your learning opportunity this week, you can either watch, you can participate in the Zoom session live, or you can watch the video of it. Right, you can review the lecture notes I just spoke of, which are on that document, or you can review these videos, which go over each topic of our serious intro to macroeconomics. What are your academic responsibilities? Same thing as every week. You have to complete the week 3 Connect assignments. So we got chapters 27, 28, 29, 30 for our week 3 Connect assignments. You all know where they are at this point. You click up here under assignments and you'll find them. All right. We got a quiz this week, multiple choice questions on these principles and concepts. So make sure you study the information, the ideas, the concepts, the principles we're covering prior to taking the quiz. So there's 15 multiple choice questions on these concepts. And then you have the discussion question where you're going to read this article about, make it pay. Will cutting unemployment benefits lead to benefits ease the labor shortage? So right now, we've not completely recovered from the COVID crisis. And there was this big debate about, should we continue to be giving people these generous social welfare benefits? Is that discouraging some people from re-entering the workforce? When we cover unemployment tonight, we'll talk about the different types of unemployment and such. You're going to read this article. Again, the article is attached to that file. And then you're going to work on this question about, is this a good idea or a bad idea? Does cutting unemployment benefits actually incentivize people to go back to work? Or do people figure, I'm going to stay out of work anyway? And then we'll talk about this idea called structural unemployment, that if you're out of the labor force for some time, you lose your job skills because you no longer have the skill set to return to the labor force. So one of the parts of this discussion question is, not only this part about, will cutting benefits incentivize people to go back to work, but if people are out for a long time, is it possible that they become structurally unemployed? So that's our academic assignment for the week, right? All right, so let's go over this in detail with the, oops, sorry, my apologies. I thought I was sharing my screen now. So real quick, everything I just discussed right here on this page, right? Everything you need. Here's the file for week 3 right here. All the learning opportunities are right here. The videos are right here. Discussion question. These 15 questions will be on the quiz. So let's get into the heart and soul of the material. So these PowerPoints are available on the week 3 tab. So we're going to be talking tonight a lot about what's called GDP, gross domestic product. Right, GDP, gross domestic product. So we got to add up all the economic activity that takes place in 1 year. So Angela, in your head, think about this. In 2021, the number hasn't come out for 2022 yet. It will be released shortly. There's estimates of it. In 2021, the United States as a country produced $23 trillion worth of goods and services. So that's what we call GDP. It's the measurement of all the economic activity that takes place in the nation. Sometimes we call it economic output. So when you hear economic output, that's synonymous with GDP. And sometimes we even just have the more brief version of just output. The output for the year was 23 trillion. So how do we add this all up? Well, what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out what was the quantity of all goods and services produced. But we can't just make a list of them that would, be exhaustive. You'd have to, the best way to put it all together is you need a common denominator, and that's the price. We take the price of all final goods and services times the quantity, and that gives us theoretically, right, how much the economy produced for the year. So when we talk about this idea of GDP, some points are really important. The idea that, okay, it's a monetary measure. We use money to add it all up of all final goods and services. So think about this. Take something like an automobile. We don't count the wheels and the sound system and the GPS system. It's all in the price of the final good and service. We don't include what are called intermediate goods, only the final good or service, right? And then whatever production takes place in the domestic United States, it does not have the companies that produce the goods and services in the US are owned by US companies or they're foreign entities. So for instance, Toyota, Honda, Mercedes, they produce automobiles in the United States, but they're based in other countries. As long as the production takes place here in the good old US of A, it counts towards US GDP, right? So last point here about what we do count. Produced, not necessarily consumed. It means if we produce goods in, say, November, December, and they're put in inventory and not sold till the following year, we still count them in that year's GDP because we try to match production with the year in which the actual economic activity took place. Now, what's not included? What's not included? Purely financial transactions. So when people receive checks from the government for welfare benefits, unemployment benefits, social security benefits, we don't add those to GDP because no good was produced, no service was provided. We would be overstating economic activity if we added purely financial transactions. So the public sector, the government, when they send checks to people, even those checks, even though those people obviously deserve their check, they're not, it's not economic activity, right? So we don't add those in. Likewise, any financial transactions in the private sector. So if I owned 100 shares of Microsoft and I sold it to someone else, it's a purely financial transaction. No good was produced, no service was provided. So we ignore purely financial transactions. So now think about this. All right, so Angela, I'm sure you can do things like get your car washed, maybe get your hair done. Maybe you pay for someone to clean your carpets. All right, so let's take the carpet cleaning example. Let's assume that you have carpets in your home, and let's assume it costs $200 to clean all the carpets, right? So how do we add up GDP? There's two approaches to adding up GDP. Either we can add up all the money that's spent on final goods and services, we call that the expenditures approach, or we can add up all the income that's generated from producing those same goods and services. All right, it sounds fancy, but let's go back to the carpet example. All right, we spend $200 to get the carpets cleaned. From my standpoint, from your standpoint, where we're a household, that's $200 worth of expenditures. From the business's standpoint, it's $200 worth of income, right? So think about this. We can either add up all the money that's spent on final goods and services, or the income generated from providing or producing those same goods and services. It will be the same number. It's two sides of the same economic coin. So we're going to concentrate our efforts on this, the expenditures approach. When we say, okay, how do we sum it all up? How do we sum up GDP? The best way to do it is to use the expenditures approach, because this is going to have application for us beyond just studying GDP, especially when we start studying things like aggregate demand and fiscal and monetary policy. So, both approaches are relatively important, but the expenditures approach is far more applicable to our future study, right? So either we can add up all the money that's spent on final goods and services, or the income generated from producing those same goods and services. Let's talk about the expenditures approach. C plus I plus G plus X. This is like the alphabet soup chapter, right? C plus I plus G plus X. So what does this mean? When we add up total economic activity for the nation, we're going to add up all the money spent by consumption expenditures, households, people like you and I. And we're going to talk about, spending money on goods in terms of both durable and non-durable goods, and services. We'll talk about the importance of services. All right, so then we'll talk about and then we have investment spending, which is a fancy way of saying when businesses spend money on machines, equipment, tools, factories, refurbishing equipment, or logistics system software, that's gross business investment, the second component. And then, of course, the government spends money. And then what we call net exports, right? We take all the imports and all the exports, we compare them, and we come up with the number for net exports. So let's talk about the first three here. When we think about the total economy, so you can put a 23 under here, right? 23 trillion for GDP in 2021. 70% of that is consumer spending. 16% is gross business investment, and 18% is government spending. Then we're going to talk about why net exports is actually a negative number. Let's go into these in more detail. So most of the economy is consumption expenditures. Most of the economy, so people like you and I, households, individuals, we spend a lot of money on durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. Now, here's the most important idea from this. Not only are personal consumption expenditures, not only are there 70% of GDP, 60% of that is what we spend on services. So consumer spending makes up the bulk of GDP, 70%, and 60% of that is spent on services. Now think about this, Angela. What type of services do you consume that you don't necessarily want to consume? Well, you got to get your car inspected. Obviously, it's good to make sure your car is running correctly, but that's something like, I got to spend money on that service. You got to go to the doctor and make sure that your body is functioning correctly every year, right? So there's another service. Got to go get your teeth cleaned. That's another service. So we spend lots of money on services as human beings. Right? 60% of our expenditures are in services. Durable goods are important because they're big ticket items and they last a long time. All right, gross business investments. This one's only, wait, where did my clicky go? Click, there we go. 16% of GDP. But it's a vitally important 16% because when we use the term gross business investment, we mean companies are spending money on equipment, tools, factories, and such. So it's very important because when companies are investing in new machines and equipment and plants and factories, they're typically positive about the economic environment, which means they're hiring people. So we as economists track this component of GDP, the I component, understanding it's an indicator of where future economic activity will be, right? So we got C and I, then we got G. 18% of GDP is government expenditures. But remember, we don't include unemployment checks, Social Security checks. We don't include welfare benefits. We don't include like disability income. Those are purely financial transactions. Again, we're not saying they're not necessary. We're just saying they don't really count towards GDP because no good was produced, no service was provided. We're trying to add up the economic activity which took place in the country. So what does count as far as government expenditures? Well, military spending, social capital on roads and schools and bridges and such. When the government has an office and they need things like supplies to, to keep their office running, all of those are counted towards GDP, and that counts to about 18% of GDP. So if we look at this again, we say, okay, 70 for consumer expenditures, then we got 16, and then we got 18. 70, 16, 18 adds up to 104. But that can't be right. How can we have 104% of GDP? It's because we have net exports. We take all of our exports, that is goods and services produced here and purchased by people in other parts of the world, minus our imports, right? Goods and services produced by companies in other countries and purchased by Americans. We know we have a trade deficit. We've discussed that a little bit in this class already. So our net export is actually a negative number. So this says negative 3%. It's right about there, 3.something%. So when you look at this final wrap up here, you got 30 plus 16 plus 18 minus 4. All right, net exports is actually a negative number. All right, we got a little problem when we're measuring GDP over time. We have a little problem when we're measuring economic output over time. So we look and say, okay, in 2010, GDP was 10 trillion. In 2011, GDP was 11 trillion. Well, on paper, when we first look at this, we say, geez, the economy grew by 10% from 10 one year to 11 the next year. Right, 1/10 is a 10% increase. But here's the problem with that logic. If GDP equals P times Q, we're trying to measure Q. We're trying to measure the quantity of goods and services produced. Like that's our goal, the Q. But prices keep changing. So look down here, it says GDP equals price times quantity. We got this triangle around price. That triangle is a Greek symbol for what we call delta or change. So what's happening is that between 2010 and 2011, prices of everything went up. So we don't really know if the economy grew by 10%. If inflation was 12%, the economy didn't even grow at all. So we have to somehow account for changes in price level to come up with what we call real GDP. Now, we got a lot to cover tonight, so I'm going to go over this example relatively quickly, knowing that you're not going to be held accountable to do the math for this. It's far more important you understand the economic idea. All right, so GDP reported in any given year is called nominal GDP. Nominal, think nominal, not adjusted for price level. So GDP reported at the prevailing year's prices. GDP reported at the price level of that year's dollars and cost of goods and services. That's nominal GDP. But if we adjust GDP for changes in the price level, now we're calculating what's called real GDP, right? So if you want to ever review these ideas, all right, what do we mean? The difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. All right, next slide down, that defines these things for you. Nominal GDP, right? Gross domestic product, not adjusted for inflation, the prevailing year's prices. Real GDP, economic output adjusted for inflation. So what the government did was they came up with a formula to calculate real GDP from nominal GDP. What did they do? They said, okay, if we take nominal GDP and we divide it by the price index, but in hundreds, then we can come up with real GDP. So what do we mean by a price index? Right? Well, what we do is we take a market basket of goods and services in a specific year, and we compare that to market basket of goods and services in any other given year, and that gives us our price index, right? So here we have a mathematical example of this. We look first at the year 2000. In 2000, nominal GDP equaled real GDP. That's not a coincidence. This is what we call our base year. So we're going to base all of our other analysis as if the prices of goods and services remain the same as it did in the base year. In other words, what if we reported economic output for 64, 74, 84, 94, and 2004? What if it was all adjusted to reflect what goods and services cost when it in the base year, the same price level as it did in the base year? Obviously, stuff cost a lot less back here, and stuff costs a little bit more out further. But what if we adjusted economic output for all years relative to the base year? So what we do is we take our nominal number for that year, and then we divide it by the price index in hundreds. Now, if we had the time, we'd do all this by hand, but look, lo and behold, ta-da, I did it all for us. All right, so we make two important observations here. First is that for all years prior to the base year, 1964, 74, 84, and 94, we look at nominal GDP versus real GDP, right? We're inflating nominal GDP to get real GDP. And for all years after the base year, we're deflating nominal GDP to get real GDP. Why is that? Well, here's why. Everything cost a heck of a lot less way back when, and things cost slightly more after the base year. That's the whole idea. We're adjusting or reporting economic output as if price level never changed. What if goods and services cost the same in every year as they did in the base year in 2000. The other idea is this, look, the further back we go, the more adjustment needs to take place. So in 1964, things cost way less than they did in 2000. So we took 663 and made it almost 3 trillion. Huge adjustment relative to in 1994, we took 7 trillion, we made it 7.8 trillion, right? And that's because prices were vastly different over that time. Now, GDP is not perfect. What are the shortcomings of GDP? All right, well, Angela, think about this. Did you ever sew your own clothes to fix them? Or just, just to make something? Right? Did you ever have somebody who's your neighbor, I don't know, repair something in your house that was fixed and you didn't have to pay somebody to do it? Right? And they just did it out of the goodness of their hearts. Right? Did you ever babysit somebody's kids? All of those are economic activities, but they're not reported because there's no transaction. So we call those non-market activities. If you paid a babysitting service to watch your children, that would be reported, taxes would be paid and such. But if they are simply activities done in the home and not reported, then they never get to be calculated as part of GDP. So we call those non-market activities. Another important idea is that the American work week has shrunk completely. In 1950, it was 50 hours a week. Now it's like 39 hours a week. So we have a lot more free time, and we can't put that in the statistic. Here's a big one. If you took a computer from 1995 versus a computer from last year, there's no comparison that the computer today works a ton better than the old one. The crazy thing is the one back in the day, that probably cost more. We can't include in the GDP statistic improvements in product quality. We know they're there, but they're not part of the number, so it's a shortcoming of GDP. Here's one, the underground economy. And we're not talking about like prostitution and drugs and such. We're talking about legitimate activities that just go unreported. So perhaps a restaurant, let's say they do $100,000 in revenue every year. And what they do is they realize, hey, we could take $30,000 in cash and just not report it. So it's a perfectly legal activity to run a restaurant, but if that restaurant takes their cash and they don't report the cash that they collect from selling food, then that's part of the underground economy. So perfectly legitimate activities that simply go unreported. Here's a crazy one, GDP and the environment. We don't subtract the pollution damage that takes place because of economic production. So think about all the pollution that is emitted into the air when we are burning fossil fuels to keep plants and factories open. We don't subtract out from the GDP number and say, well, there was, $500 billion worth of environmental damage that took place because of the economic activity of the United States. And here's a crazier thing. When we do environmental damage, like the Exxon Valdez washed up in Alaska, or we had that BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, when we have to spend money cleaning up environmental issues, that actually adds to GDP because it's a service. Now, it's kind of crazy to say, like, okay, our GDP increased because of the environmental damage we did, but that's true. Right? Next one, competition and distribution of output. If you have children, maybe you think they shouldn't be watching this movie. They shouldn't be playing that video game, right? Maybe you just don't believe that anyone should own a gun, right? So GDP is just a statistic. It's just a number. It doesn't make any moral or ethical judgments about what's produced or how it's produced. It's okay. That's the number, right? Then the last one is simply what we call non-economic source of well-being. The Economist every year releases what they call GNH, gross national happiness. And they measure things besides just good old number of GDP. So you guys, what's the psychological well-being of people in countries? Right? How much community vitality is there? Does the country have good governance and such? And then they actually published a list. So here's a list from 2016. They rank countries about where they stand in terms of gross national happiness. So even though the United States is by far the largest economy, we came up 14th on this list in 2016 about gross national happiness. All right, so there's our first chapter. Now we're going to do the next few relatively quickly, right? So we said this the first day of class. There's 8 economic goals, and one of them is economic growth. So it's important for us to grow the economy. Why? Because it lessens that burden of scarcity. It increases standards of living. Right? So if you think about this, if we produce 23 in 2021, we produced $23 trillion worth of output. Economists argue that for us to continually sustain an increase in standard of living, the economy needs to grow year over year. So we need economic output the following year to be 3% greater than this year. Right? And that, my friends, is what we call economic growth. So there's 2 sources of economic growth, and we remember this from the Production Possibility Frontier. Either we can have an improvement in either we can have an improvement in resource quantity or quality. So either we're increasing the quantity or we're increasing the quality of land and capital and labor and the entrepreneur, the resources, or there's some increase in productivity / technology. Now, when you look at those 2 potential sources for econ growth, by far, the one that's more important is technology productivity. Right? Advances in technology and productivity account for 67% of the increase in GDP. So economic growth is mostly generated by increase in productivity. So when you look and say, geez, well, productivity, that's a pretty important topic. If you were taking this class at St. Jude University or Montgomery County Community College, and we had the 15-week time frame where we had a little bit more leeway on what we could do with some of the assignments, you'd be asked to do a project presentation. And one of the topics I encourage students to investigate is why productivity has slowed to not a halt, but really a lot slower than it was 10, 15 years ago. So it's a bit of a worry because it generates so much economic growth, right? So quickly again, GDP, year over year, we desire, we want economic output to expand, to grow. Now, how do we measure growth? There's 2 ways to do it. Well, we already talked about one, and that is an increase in real GDP. So if we take economic output and we adjust it for changes in price level, and we say, okay, this year it's slightly higher than it was last year, we've achieved an increase in real GDP. The other important measure of economic growth, or the potential for economic growth, is what we call real GDP per capita, or sometimes just per capita GDP. And what we mean by that is, what if we take the population of the country, and we take economic output and divide it by the population? So we said, okay, total economic production for the nation divided by population, that gives us roughly an estimate of how much each person in the country shared in the economic activity. And we know that's not the case. Some people get a lot more than others, but it's one interesting way to look at economic production, economic standing of a nation. So we call this idea per capita GDP. And it turns out it's a very, very important number. Let me show you why. The United States has the world's largest economy. And who is number 2? China. But then when we look at, this is the top 25 countries per capita GDP. So we take economic output divided by the population to per capita GDP. The United States doesn't rank number 2 like they did when you measure total economic activity. But it's not a complete and utter failure. We rank actually 11th in the list of per capita GDP. Now, China, who's the world's second largest economy, they're not even on this list for top 25. So although China has the second largest economy in the world, its per capita GDP doesn't rank in the top 25. So, I mean, Ireland is a drop in a bucket of China's total economic output, but they rank high in per capita GDP. What we're saying here is that the average standard of living is much better in Ireland than it is in China, right? So per capita GDP is an extremely important economic measure. All right, let me scroll back up here. Another idea about economic growth. This is an interesting one. You may have heard this in one of your math classes. We call it the Rule 70. And the Rule 70 says, if you want to know how long it's going to take for any statistic to double in value, you need to divide it by into the 70 factor. So I'm going to give you a simple example, right? So you say, okay, I want to know how long it's going to take for it to get twice as warm in this room that I'm in right now. So we'll say, okay, it's currently 50 degrees in here. Well, twice as warm would be 100. So you say, okay, how long will it take my 50-degree room to get up to 100? We say, well, what if it's getting 7% warmer every 10 minutes? So we know our rate of change is 7%. So we take this 70, and then we say divide it by 10, divided by 7. 70 divided by 7 works out to be 10. In 10 periods, so 10 times 10, in 100 minutes, it will be twice as warm in here, right? What's way more important for us is economic output doubling. So somebody said to you, how long will it take US GDP to double? Well, we can use our Rule 70. If the economy is growing at 2%, 70 divided by 2, right? That works out to 35 years. So if the economy is growing at 2%, it takes 35 years for economic output to double. What if we're growing at not 2%, but 4%, and you think, oh, geez, it's only a 2% difference. It can't be that big of a deal. One economy is growing at 2%, one economy is growing at 4%. But if you take 70 divided by 4, that only works out to be 17 and a half years. So growing slightly faster means a huge difference over time when you talk about standards of living and how long it takes economic output to double. Right? So that's why the Rule 70 is very important. When just making a generalization about standards of living and how long it will take economic production to double within a country. All right, our next topic is called the business cycle. Boop, boop, boop. Where are we? Sorry, here we go down. All right, so it would be nice if our economy grew at an even keel 2.5 to 3% all the time. That would be sweet. That would be easy peasy, lemon squeezy. Unfortunately, we don't have that luxury. The economy goes through these periods of economic growth, which we call expansions. Then the expansion peaks for a moment in time. Then we go into these doldrums, these bad times called economic recessions. And then thankfully things stop getting bad and we hit the bottom and it becomes what's known as the trough, and then we start all over again. So business cycles are an inevitable aspect of capitalism, right? So business cycles are a byproduct of the capitalist system. And some argue that, they're necessary to sort of clean the inefficiencies of certain industries and such. There's many theories about the business cycle, but let's look more formally at a graph. So I strongly advise you, Angela, to write this into your notebook. All right, so let's look at this graph or chart. Label the axis. Make sure you label this clearly and correctly. This is time on the horizontal, and this is the level of real output. Let's make sure everybody knows what this means. Time is simple. We say, okay, this will be 1950, and over here will be 2023. So this is the modern era of economic activity. 1950, 2023, that's 73 years. 73 years, that's time, that's easy. Level of real output, this is easy as well. We just went over this. This is economic output adjusted for inflation. So this is real GDP, okay? So over time, how much has the economy grown? So when we look at this blue upward sloping line, this is called the growth trend line. We say, on average, in the long run, the economy grows, right? So we can make our first observation that in the long run, it's onward and upwards for the US economy. It continues to grow. But we don't have even keel perfect growth all the time. If we did, we wouldn't need macroeconomics. Right? If there was no swings and fluctuations, there would be no economics. Now, these little, like, we'll call them undulations, because the economy expands, it's a peak, it contracts, it's a trough, it expands again, it's a peak. This is a little misguiding because it makes it look like they're all of equal magnitude when it comes to how strong an economic growth period is, or how weak an economic contraction might be. That's not the case. We can have really prolonged, excellent economic expansions, and we can have really bad, prolonged economic contractions, or they can be short-lived, right? So it's not a one-size-fits-all. So we have what's called the 4 phases of the business cycle. When real GDP is positive and the economy is growing, we call that the expansion. The peak is a temporary maximum. It only lasts for a moment. And then we have the economic woes, call it contraction or a recession. When things stop getting better, when we've gone beyond the peak, all of a sudden we have a slowdown in the economy, we have a recession. And then thankfully things stop getting bad and we trough, we hit the bottom before things start to pick up again, right? So the 4 phases of the business cycle happen against the backdrop of long run economic growth. So that's why this trend line is important. It shows that in the long run, we're pretty darn sure the economy will grow. In any given year, we can't tell you what the economy is doing. Right? Now, you remember in math class, you took that math where you had to calculate the slope of a line. Well, the slope of this line would be the long run economic growth rate of the US economy. So the growth, the slope of this line would be something like 2.7 over 1. 2.7% of the economy grows over long periods. Now, this chart here shows you actual business. Oops, sorry, let me just click on this. There we go. Actual business cycles from 1930 through 2005. This is the same idea with just a slightly different background. All right, so let's talk about this and make sense of this for a moment. First, this is the Great Depression from 1930 through the start of World War II. So you can see these radical swings in economic activity during this horrific period in US economic history. You can also see that since the war, we've had a much more even keel, predictable path through our economy. Most people, not all, most economists believe that the reason why the economy stabled out and then remained relatively stable for years after World War II is quite simple. Is that back here, the government allowed for laissez-faire economics and didn't get too involved with the economy until the Great Depression started. And most people believe that active government intervention in the economy doesn't eliminate the business cycle, but makes the swings less radical, if that makes sense. Okay. Now, why do business cycles exist? I'm going to send people a video to watch. And we're just one of those things where if you want to watch it, it goes over this in pretty good detail. And you can watch it at your own leisure. It might help you with answering the discussion question. Definitely can help you answer. I'm sorry, can definitely help you with the quiz. But there's a few theories on why business cycles exist. Excuse me. Why we don't have sustained long run average economic growth right around the average rate. Why we have economic expansions, a peak, a recession, a trough, and then joy to the world, we start over again. So one theory is that we have what's called irregular innovation. So if you think about things like, okay, what about the railroads? We introduced the railroads into the economic system. You're like, geez, that was a catalyst for growth. Boom, all right, all of a sudden we can transport goods across the country, low cost and quickly. And then that economic advantage fizzled out and such, right? And that makes some sense to some degree. Then we have this second idea, productivity changes, and this is one that's very important, right? Productivity seems to go in these cycles where we have a jolt of productivity, and then we seem to be lacking any improvements in productivity. So you could argue that, right? Let's talk about these next two in conjunction with one another. Monetary factors and asset bubbles. We should really say asset, not just financial. It's any type of assets. So the Federal Reserve controls the nation's money supply. Right now, the Federal Reserve has been raising interest rates because they fear inflation might become entrenched, that is to say, difficult to deal with if they do nothing. So the Fed is actually running the risk of causing a mild recession because of their policies. But the argument would be, well, better a mild recession caused by raising interest rates by the Fed than severe inflation that we can't get rid of for 2 decades like we had in the 70s into the 80s, right? So that could be a factor. Now, we all know about asset bubbles. In the year 2000, the dot-com bubble went burst, and that caused a recession. In the year 2008, we had the financial collapse and the housing bubble. Both of those bubble burst at the same time, right? So that can definitely impact business cycles. Look, unexpected political events. What happened last year? Russia, crazy man, Putin invades Ukraine, and that's huge impact on geopolitical economic events. The price of food skyrockets. There's an article in the Economist this week about people in Egypt can't get the food they need because everything costs so much. Right, so those type of factors also could create the business cycle. All right, now we need to talk about the two problems that coincide with the business cycle. But before we do that, well, let's introduce them for a moment. Then I want to go back to the business cycle graph so you can see this. All right, the two problems are what we call unemployment and inflation. That's the two potential problems. Where did this go? Here it is right here. Unemployment and inflation. All right, so these are our two what we call macroeconomic worries, so to speak, macroeconomic worries. In other words, because we have these swings in the business cycle, we have to deal with either unemployment rising above what we would say is an acceptable level, or price level rising above an acceptable level. Now, I'm going to show you this in a moment, but typically, sorry, can't get the mouse there. To do back to our little graph. Typically, there's a trade-off. When the economy is expanding, unemployment tends to be dropping. The unemployment rate tends to be dropping, but price level or inflation tends to increase as we reach the peak of the business cycle. And that seems to be the case in this business cycle. We've had an economic expansion ever since we went back to work after the COVID pandemic. We've had that happen. And then what normally happens is that during an economic downturn, unemployment becomes a problem. The unemployment rate rises, but because the economy is weak, there's not much pressure on inflation. So normally there's a trade-off between these two variables, but that's not always the case. We've had specific but rare points in U.S. economic history where both higher unemployment and higher inflation became issues or events at the same time. But normally there's a trade-off between the two. I just wanted to mention that before we start studying them in detail. All right, so let's talk about unemployment. All right, first, what do we mean by unemployed? What do we mean by unemployed? We got to come up with a number for the unemployment rate. And here's how we do it. We take this approach. We take the entire US population, which is today 330 million people. In the year that we represented on our little slide here, there was 315 million, right? Today we have 330 million. But not all of those people matter for the unemployment rate calculation. There's no sense in even considering kids. So 0 till 16 years old, you're out. We don't even count you because you're not in the labor force. You're not going to be working, you're in school. Likewise, people who have retired, like they said, okay, I worked 20, 30, 40 years, and now it's time for me to, enjoy what's left of the life I have, and good for you. Those people, they're not counted either. So if you're not actively seeking a job, you're not part of the labor force. You don't count towards the statistic. So obviously, kids aren't looking for jobs, and elderly people who have retired, they stop looking, right? So kids under 16 and people who are elderly that are retired, not in the labor force. There's a couple other groups that are not in the labor force. The first one is the one we love to hate. People that are independently wealthy and they don't need to work, and they're like, oh, I'm going to go for a ride on my yacht, or I'm going to drive around in my my beautiful new Lexus or Cadillac or Mercedes, whatever. So if you have so much money you don't need to work and you're not looking for work, you're not in the labor force. Right? Now, unfortunately, some people are institutionalized, and the U.S. prison population has expanded rapidly since 1985. That's a problem. But if you're in prison, you're not looking for work, you're not in the labor force. The last one, though, is interesting because this happens when a recession occurs and people just lose faith in their thought that they can get a new job or they can get a job. We call these people discouraged workers. So if you're between 18 and really 55, 60, and you give up on looking for work because you're so frustrated. You tried, but no one wants to answer your calls or your emails or your inquiries and get the job, right? Those discouraged workers, they're not part of the labor force. So the easiest way to describe, say, oh, I took an economics class. How do we calculate unemployment? Very simple. First, we come up with the labor force, and that includes two groups of people. Everyone with a job plus everyone actively seeking employment. So the labor force is everyone currently working plus everyone actively seeking a job. You add those two groups together, you come up with a number, and that's the labor force. In the United States today, it's about 156 million. Actually, it's a good question. That was my latest estimate. Let me just see what this says. Do, 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 do. Size of the U.S. labor force. All right, so Google says 160, 161 as of December 2000. Oh, actually, December 2022, 165, just underneath that. So that, the U.S. labor force is about 165 million people. So if you take the total U.S. labor force, that's our denominator, and we look at the number of people looking for work, we put that in our numerator, come out with a number, right, make it a percentage, that is our unemployment rate. Now, the statistic isn't perfect because of a few reasons. Number one, if you're a discouraged worker, you're not counted. We mentioned that. Number two, if you'd like to be working full-time, but you're working part-time, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, the BLS, if you're working 20 hours, but you'd like to be working 40 hours, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics does not differentiate. So part-time workers are considered workers. So that really skews the number a bit. And then finally, this last idea, it's called underemployment. Now, what does that mean? Let's say there's just a wicked smart woman who got a degree in engineering and she's working for DuPont down in Delaware. And she's just out of school and she's only been working for 2 years. And DuPont loves her because she's a great employee. But then a severe recession hits and they come to her and say, look, this is absolutely positively nothing personal. But we, our revenues are off 28%. We have to get rid of some of the labor force. You're one of the last people we hired. We pray that you're still available as an employee when things pick up, because we want to hire you back. We understand that that's not the case. And they let her go. And then she thinks, all right, well, right now I can't get a job as an engineer because, these firms just aren't looking for people. But she travels down to the local supermarket and says, look, you had to sign for manager. And the guy says, yeah, I need a third shift manager. So she gets hired as a manager of a supermarket from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. When you think about her skill set, she should be doing something dynamic. She's doing something below her skill set. We call that underemployment. Now that's bad for two reasons. Number one, if you think about her potential contribution to the U.S. economy, crazy, smart, intelligent person, she's more valuable as an engineer than she is as somebody managing the supermarket. Now look, managing the supermarket is not a job to snub or to be, but the other reason it's bad is because there's a guy or a girl, there's a woman or a man who should be having that job and they lose that job because another person takes it, even though it's below their skill set. So during a recession, we tend to see this idea of underemployment. Another reason why this statistic isn't perfect. All right, now there's three types of unemployment. There we go. What are the three types of unemployment? We have what's called frictional unemployment, structural unemployment, and cyclical unemployment. If you're taking notes, something you should mark down is that there's always going to be some unemployment in the economy. There's always going to be some level of unemployment. Even during economic booms, unemployment doesn't get even close to 0%. Never happens. So if you look at this and says frictional and structural, those two types of unemployment always exist. No matter what phase of the business cycle we're in, we're always going to have some frictional, and always have some structural unemployment. Together, we actually call them the natural rate of unemployment or the full employment number. So we expect there to be frictional and we expect there to be structural unemployment all the time, right? Therefore, the cyclical, and by name you can see this, cyclical unemployment, that only happens during certain phase of the business cycle, right? All right, so let's talk about all three of these. Frictional unemployment, this is going to sound like a funny description. It's sometimes referred to as voluntary unemployment. The key idea here is that anybody who's frictionally unemployed, they have job skills. But what they've done is they voluntarily left the position to look for something else. So let's say some woman graduates from college and she works at a job for 3 years, and one day she says, I'm giving my 2 weeks notice. Like, I don't like being in this cubicle. I think my talents are, beyond this job. I'm gonna look for something better. So she has a college degree, she has some work experience. She could probably find a new job in a couple of days if she wanted, but she's gonna take some time to look around and find something different, right? She has job skills, she's voluntarily unemployed, she's frictionally unemployed. Right, let's say that two people graduate from college and they're dating, and then all of a sudden, the woman says, "Oh, I got a job offer in Minnesota. It's a great promotion." And the guy's like, "Well, I really think that we have a long-term potential here. I'm going to quit my job and move to Minnesota with you." Well, he leaves his job voluntarily and he's going to look for a new job somewhere else. There's going to be a period of time when he's unemployed, but he will find a job. So this is the least serious type of unemployment, frictional unemployment. And it harkens back to that economic goal of economic freedom. Now, structural unemployment, this one, again, the name says something about it. Something has changed about the structure of the economy where we no longer need those people. The good that they produce or the service they provided is no longer in strong demand. But here's the worry. If you work in a specific industry for a specific amount of time, you got sort of skills honed to one type of production. And you might not be able to get a new job until you find new skills. So structurally unemployed people are a problem because there might be a mismatch between the skills they possess and the skills that are in demand in the economy. So there's an economist, his name was Schumpeter. He coined this phrase, creative destruction. And it's a natural process, natural phenomena of macroeconomics in a capitalist system. Innovation, creativity ultimately destroys goods and services in a good way. We no longer need people standing at a toll booth. We have E-ZPass, right? Nobody wants a DVD player anymore. They can stream everything. So when there's inevitable structural changes in the distribution and types of products and services produced, it's going to disrupt the demand for certain types of labor, right? So we take these two together. Again, that's called the natural rate of unemployment or full employment. So when we look at the number of people who are frictionally unemployed plus the number of people who are structurally unemployed, right, that comes out to about 4% today. Now, it used to be about 6% in the 80s. So why has the number come down? Well, there's usually four factors: is that older population in the United States, there's fewer people in the workforce, that the internet and temp agencies have really reduced the wait and seek time between losing a job and finding something else. In essence, you can find something even if it's not something that's perfect, at least you're getting some income. The other two are interesting. In the early 90s, Bill Clinton signed into law, President Clinton signed into law, what was called the welfare for work requirement. And what it said was, you can't stay on welfare forever. We're going to cut your benefits. And the Europeans, criticized America as being very, inhumane. It worked out to be a tremendous benefit. I'm sorry, from a tremendous program because it was implemented so intelligently. One of the good things the government did. We didn't just cut off people's benefits altogether. So if you were somebody who was struggling financially, economically, you were allowed to re-enter the workforce, make some money without losing your entire benefits, and then sort of, get some experience underneath you and work your way up, which was tremendous because it got people off of welfare and back working and feeling good about themselves. The last one is a depressing factor, is like I said earlier, since 1985, the U.S. prison population has doubled. So today we think that full employment or the natural rate of unemployment is about 4%. In fact, we can get rid of this. Not about 4 or 5%, it's about 4%, right? So that leaves our last type of unemployment, cyclical unemployment. When the economy is in the business cycle phase known as a recession, when economic growth has tanked, GDP is faltering, unemployment is going to go above the acceptable 4%. So cyclical unemployment, therefore, is directly related to the business cycle, and it occurs when we have insufficient total demand to sustain full employment domestic output, which is a fancy way of saying we're in a recession, when the economy is contracting, right? Now, there was an economist who said, you know what, I can calculate what the cost of this is. So there's an economist, his name is Ocon, and he said, I can calculate what the cost is to society when there's cyclical unemployment. And what he did was he did all this mathematics, all this regression, all this, statistics, and he looked at what would be the total potential output for the country versus what the total economic output actually was for the nation. And he compared the two, and then he looked at the unemployment rate during those periods, and he came up with what he called Ocon's law. And most economists believe that, it's somewhat accurate. It's somewhat accurate when you try to calculate what's the economic cost of a recession in terms of lost potential outputs. So if you think into our study of production possibility, said, okay, we can operate on our curve at our potential level of economic production only if we're putting to use all of our available resources. We're at full employment. So when unemployment goes up above an acceptable level, that's not good. So we can look at this with a nice little chart, right? We'll look at this one first. This is 85 to 2005. So I'm gonna make this bigger here. Oop, where are you going? Where are you going? Oh, my computer's crazy. I guess I can't start the slideshow. All right, we'll just look at it. This will be good enough. All right, here we go. Let's make this slightly smaller. Slightly bigger. All right, down bottom, we simply have the unemployment rate from 1992 through, actually, I wanted to look at this one first, from 1985 through 2005. So we can see unemployment was about 7%, 85, dropped, rose again, then dropped precipitously through the 90s. And we had, all right, so you can see here, all right, we're coming out of a recession, unemployment rate goes down, things are getting better. Then we have another recession, then we have another economic expansion, then we have another recession. So the unemployment rate tells us what's going on with the economy. These two lines up here, the black line shows us potential output for the nation. Sorry, the red line. The red line is the potential. The red is the potential economic production for the country. The black is what actually happened. So what we've done here is we've calculated potential GDP versus actual GDP. Right? And we can see that when unemployment rises above an acceptable rate, we create what's called a GDP gap. And that shows us the foregone outputs. So for Ocon, he said, okay, for every 1% that that unemployment is above the natural rate of unemployment, for every 1% of cyclical unemployment, there's a 2% GDP gap. Now, one of the worst recessions in US economic history was in 2008. We can really see the pronounced effect here. We can look over here and say, this red line shows us our potential economic output. The blue shows us where we actually operated. In 2008, you can see this divergence. Unemployment went above 10%. There was a huge gap basically saying all this is lost economic production, aka lost economic consumption for Americans, right? Because of that severe recession, because of the financial crisis and the housing bubble burst. All right, let's get into our last aspect, of the night, and that is inflation. So changes in the price level. Everyone is familiar with the unemployment rate. You've all heard that. There are multiple statistics which measure and report on changes in the price level. There are multiple statistics which measure and report changes in the price level. The one that's most familiar to most people is called the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. So that's the one we're going to use, the CPI, and if it's a measure of the price level by tracking the prices of all the goods and services that the average person needs to buy. So when you look at the Consumer Price Index, you have in there education, entertainment, you have energy, you have housing, right? You have consumer durables. We have a whole market basket of all the goods and services that people have to purchase. We have the market basket of goods and services that people have to purchase. That's what the CPI tracks for us. Sorry, I lost my, I scrolled down by mistake. So the most important thing to remember is the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, it is an average. In other words, when we track the prices of all these goods and all these services, there's no way that they're all going up in price or that they're all going down in price. It's the statistical impossibility. So the CPI is an average price of the average price level in the economy, right? So three things can be happening. Right? We could have inflation. So most likely we're going to have an increase in the price level of goods and services. It could be mild or it could be a little bit more severe. So since the Great Depression, we've never had the second one, which we'll talk about momentarily, but normally we have some increase in the average price level of goods and services. What is the target? 2%. So when you talk about where we would like this number to be, we want it to be somewhere around 2%. So it's actually a healthy byproduct of a functioning economy when prices go up at about 2% per year. Now, we could have a decline or a decrease in the average price level. This is a good example of the fallacy of composition. What's good for one is good for everyone. When you go to the store and you think, oh, I'm happy, everything I have to buy is on sale, it costs less. So you think, oh, that's good. Well, it might be good for you personally, but deflation is more of a serious economic worry than inflation, believe it or not. It can cause what we have experienced during the Great Depression. So if we have a decrease in the average price level of goods and services, we call that deflation. It almost happened for a brief period after the 2008 financial crisis, and it almost happened again right after the onset of the pandemic. Now, this third one is a term that economists use, but you have to be careful. Disinflation simply means we still have inflation, but it's not as bad as the previous period. I even went as far as to provide an example here. So, okay, inflation was 10% in 1977. It was only 8% in 1978. In both years, we have inflation. We've had inflation, but relative to the previous year, inflation wasn't quite as bad. That's exactly what's going on right now in the U.S. economy, right? Last year, price of goods and services were going up by nearly 9% in the first half of the year. Then inflation cooled off to just over 6% or close to 7% in the second half of the year. This year, they're going to be a little bit less, but we still have inflation, just not as bad as the previous period. So now that we know this, we should really say, okay, well, what causes inflation? So there's two types of inflation. One is called demand pull inflation, and one is called cost push inflation. So when we look at these two types of inflation, demand pull and cost push, let's talk generally, what is the cause of these increases in price level above an acceptable rate? So demand pull inflation is highly correlated with the business cycle. Like cost push inflation is highly correlated with what we call negative supply shocks, right? So let's go over these in more detail. This graph helps us understand demand pull inflation. On the vertical axis, we're measuring inflation, the general price level in the economy. On the horizontal axis, we're measuring total production and unemployment. So we are measuring all three of our macroeconomic variables on these two axes. Price level, aka inflation on the vertical axis, and GDP, aka real domestic output, right? Economic production adjusted for inflation, plus the unemployment rates on the horizontal axis. So if we look at our curve here, what is this telling us? It's telling us that when economic output is weak, we don't have any serious demand for resources and finished goods and services. We probably won't expect inflation. When economic output gets too strong, the opposite happens, where we have too much money chasing too few goods. We have an excess of spending relative to the economy's ability to produce, right? Now, this little marker down here, QF, that's going to help us, before we get into the detailed explanation of this, understand where we are with this potential of demand pull inflation. So QF is a fancy way of saying economic production right at the Goldilocks level, right at where we want economic activity to be, where the economy is growing at a pace that is sustainable, but not too fast for what we would say potential increase in price level. So we have this balance between the economy growing too slowly and unemployment being a problem, or too fast and upward pressure on prices. So QF is the Goldilocks scenario. So let's look at these three we call ranges. In range one, we're in a recession. GDP has fallen, unemployment is high, and there's no upward pressure on prices. There's a lot of what we call slack in the economy, underutilized or unused economic capacity. There's lots of people who want to be working who can't find jobs. There's lots of machines that are sitting idle in factories and such. Because there's underemployment of economic resources, the demand for capital, the demand for labor is weak. There's no upward pressure on resource prices because people don't have tremendous economic opportunity. There's a high level of unemployment. There's also not tremendous increase in the demand for final goods and services. So when the economy is weak, GDP is faltering, unemployment's high, there's no upward pressure on prices. Right? People are just barely getting by. No one's asking for a raise. But eventually things get better as we move into range two. People get called back to work. Right? The demand for resources increases. Some of that, what we call capacity utilization, gets used up. There's not as much slack. Right? Machines are getting turned on in factories and such. It doesn't happen the same rate in every industry, but little by little, the economy improves. GDP starts to increase, unemployment starts to fall, and as people feel better about the economic situation, spending increases. The price of resources go up, the price of goods and services, and we approach what we call full employment domestic output, a fancy way of saying everything's pretty good. So over here, unemployment 10%, inflation 1%, right? GDP negative. As we move this way, unemployment falling, GDP rising, and then some inflation, some upward pressure on prices. So at our Goldilocks, everything's perfect. We would expect our three variables to be right about where they are in the long run. Right, 2.8% economic growth, 4% unemployment, 2% inflation. So everything's perfect there. If we could stay there, it'd be nice. But look what happens. Why does this curve turn vertical? It gets back to the very definition of economics. For the short run, for this period of time, we only have so much land, capital, labor, and entrepreneurability. The economy has a capacity to produce. beyond a certain level, we cannot achieve any more economic output. Right? You can't keep a factory open 25 hours. Right? You can't put to work people that aren't born yet or aren't in the labor force. Right? You can't extract resources which don't exist. So notice that when we hit what we call here the proverbial wall, the opportunity for GDP to increase is pretty minimal beyond some level of spending. So any spending in excess of the economy's ability to produce has this byproduct of inflation. That's why it's called demand pull inflation. Demand for resources, demand for final goods and services continues to increase, but it's spending beyond the ability of the economy to keep up, right? Too much money chasing too few goods is the famous saying. That's demand pull inflation. Now, the opposite is something we actually worried about last year to some extent. We call this cost push inflation. We need the economic inputs to produce goods and services. We need, oil, copper, minerals, right? What happens when we have what's called a supply shock? So what happens when the price of oil goes from $60 a barrel to $110 a barrel? This is what we were worried about last year when Russia invaded Ukraine, right? What happens is that would cause our entire curve to move to the left, to shift left, to decrease. So this Y here represents GDP, and this P here represents inflation. So everything was perfect in the world, right? Let's assume that for a minute. GDP is growing at about 2.8%, unemployment's about 4%, and inflation is about 2%. And then we suffer one of these negative supply shocks, forcing the entire curve to shift left, to decrease. Look what happens to all of our variables. We got to talk about GDP, unemployment, and inflation. The negative supply shock causes GDP to decline. It also causes unemployment to rise. But on top of that, it causes inflation. So a severe increase in the price of a necessary resource such as oil can create cost push inflation. A negative supply shock forces GDP into a recession, unemployment to rise, at the same time we have inflation. All right, we got to finish up by talking about who wins and who loses when it comes to inflation. First, let's talk about nominal versus real interest rates. So if you get a loan, there's going to be a number on there. You sign a loan for, to borrow money for a car or a house or something. Right? The stated rate is what we call the nominal rate. Whatever the lender and the borrower, whatever they agree to. Right? If you buy a bond, let's say you bought a 10-year government bond, it's going to have a number on there, what interest they will pay you on for lending the government your money. So the stated rate is the nominal rate. But in between the agreement being originated and when it's over, there's probably going to be some level of inflation. So inflation is going to really affect that nominal rate. We got to calculate what's called the real rate of interest. So for a moment, let's assume that we borrowed money at 11%. So we got a mortgage on our house and we borrowed $100,000 and the interest rate's 11%. And we borrowed the money for 20 years. But over those 20 years, inflation is 6% on average. So if you take the stated rate, the nominal rate, and then you factor in the inflation, the real rate of interest is 5%, not 11%. So what do we mean by that? So, okay, if you're the bank and you lent the money, you're waiting to get paid back that money, right? Are you really earning 11%? Well, not really, because even though it says 11% on the loan, when you get paid back the money, inflation has eroded the purchasing power of that 11% by 6%, right? The purchasing power of that money is actually declined because the prices of everything is going up. So you're really only earning 5%. So when we talk about who's hurt by inflation, if you're a lender, you're hurt by inflation, right? You lent the money, you're waiting to get paid back. Inflation is eroding the value of the money you get receiving, the purchasing power of the dollars that are being paid back. If you're the borrower, it's the opposite. Borrowers are actually helped by inflation, right? You borrowed at 11%, right? You're paying back over time. Prices of everything's going up 6%. Your real rate of interest is only 5%. But what if you're a saver? What if you said, okay, I'm gonna take my $100,000, I'm gonna buy this bond that has an 11% interest rate. You're like, yes, I'm gonna earn 11%. Every year I'm gonna get 11% return, guaranteed. Yeah, you'll get 11% in theory, but the price of everything is going up 6% per year. So after you factor in inflation, you're only earning 5%, right? So there's one more group of people what we call COLA. If you have what's called a cost of living adjustment, theoretically, you're not hurt and you're not helped by inflation, right? Theoretically. So think about this. If you're getting a Social Security check, your Social Security benefits are supposed to be adjusted based on the government's measure of inflation. So the money you receive on a monthly basis should go up based on changes in the price level. So this is important because it talks about the economics of inflation. Who's hurt, who's helped, and who's really theoretically not affected by inflation, right? All right, so for next week, make certain that you finish those Connect assignments for these chapters. Make sure you finish that 15-question multiple choice quiz and make certain that you participate in the weekly discussion after reading that article. Right? Everything you need is on the week 3 document, which is available on the announcements. It's available on the course module page, and I send it to everyone through Canvas message. All right, but have a good week. If you need anything, reach out.